A 13-year-old black boy, often lost in thought during class, is suddenly called out by his teacher. He's forced to stand and face a math equation far beyond his grade level. His classmates, some laughing, others doubtful, watch him with skepticism. But what they don't know is that the boy standing at the board is a hidden math prodigy. The midday sun cast warm streaks of light across the linoleum floors of Willow Creek Middle School. It was early autumn in Portland, Oregon, and the classrooms hummed with the low murmur of students chatting and chairs scraping against the floor. Room 204 was no exception. The buzz of adolescent energy filled the space as students filed in for their 8th grade math class. At the back of the room, near the window, Ethan Brooks, a black boy, settled into his usual seat. The 13-year-old had a quiet presence that allowed him to fade into the background. His brown eyes, sharp but often distant, wandered toward the world outside as he placed his notebook on the desk. His posture was relaxed, almost too much so, with one arm resting on the desk and the other propping up his chin. The scene beyond the window, a few trees swaying gently in the breeze, a squirrel darting across the grass, seemed to capture his attention far more than the bustling classroom around him. Ethan wasn't inattentive by choice. He had a sharp mind, one that often worked faster than the pace of classroom lessons. Numbers and equations fascinated him, but the repetitive drills and slow progress of his math class felt uninspiring. Instead of raising his hand or engaging, he let his mind drift, finding solace in the steady rhythm of the world outside. His notebook, though mostly blank on the assigned pages, hid margins filled with advanced equations and solutions he'd scribbled during his free time, puzzles he had challenged himself to solve. At the front of the room, Mrs. Laura Bennett stood with her arms crossed, surveying the class as they took their seats. A no-nonsense teacher with years of experience, Mrs. Bennett was known for her sharp tongue and high expectations. Her tailored blazer and neatly styled hair only added to her aura of authority. She prided herself on being able to spot potential in her students and wasn't afraid to push them when she thought they weren't meeting their capabilities. Today, however, her patience was wearing thin. The results of the most recent math test lay in a neat stack on her desk, and while a few students had performed well, the majority had struggled. Mrs. Bennett didn't tolerate mediocrity, and the sight of so many low scores left her questioning whether her students were putting in the effort she demanded. She picked up the stack of papers and began calling names, handing back the tests with brief comments. "Decent work," she'd say to some, and "You need to study more," to others. When she reached Ethan's desk, she hesitated for a moment. His test sat at the top of the stack, marked with a large red 100% circled at the top. It wasn't the first time Ethan had aced a test, but his apparent lack of interest in class frustrated her. Handing him the paper, she made no comment, her lips pressing into a thin line as she walked back to the front of the room. "All right, listen up." Mrs. Bennett's voice cut through the chatter, silencing the room. She placed the stack of tests on her desk and leaned against it, her sharp gaze scanning the rows of students. "Most of you did okay," she began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But a lot of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks." Ethan, barely listening, rested his chin on his hand as his eyes drifted back to the window. The soft rustle of leaves outside seemed far more engaging than Mrs. Bennett's critique. He didn't notice her sharp eyes flicker in his direction as she continued. "This is basic algebra," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice rising slightly. "You'll need to understand this if you want to succeed in high school, college, or anywhere else in life." She paused, her gaze lingering on Ethan's distant expression. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. "Ethan Brooks!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the silence. Ethan jolted upright, his hand slipping from his chin as his classmates turned to look at him. His heart raced, and heat rushed to his cheeks. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Bennett narrowed her eyes. "You seem very interested in what's going on outside," she said, nodding toward the window. "Care to share what's so fascinating?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but quickly shut it again, unsure of what to say. The room filled with a few muffled chuckles, but Mrs. Bennet wasn't smiling. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," she continued, her tone sharp. "Come up here." The room went silent as Ethan stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His classmates watched with a mix of amusement and curiosity, some whispering under their breath. "She's going to roast him," one student muttered. "He never talks. He doesn't even know what's going on," another added, stifling a laugh. Ethan swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he walked to the front of the room. He could feel the weight of their eyes, every step making the distance to the whiteboard feel impossibly long. Mrs. Bennet stood by the board, marker in hand, her expression unreadable. "Let's see how much you've been paying attention," she said, writing an equation on the board. It was complex, far beyond what the class had covered, but not impossible for someone with talent. She stepped back, holding the marker out to him. "Go ahead," she said, her tone almost challenging. "Show us what you've got." Ethan took the marker, the cool plastic pressing into his hand. He stared at the equation for a moment, his mind racing. The whispers and quiet laughter behind him only made the pressure worse. His heart pounded, and for a fleeting moment, he considered handing the marker back and walking away. But something stopped him. A small voice inside reminded him of the countless hours he had spent solving problems just like this one. This wasn't about Mrs. Bennet or his classmates. It was about him and what he knew he could do. Ethan took a deep breath, raised the marker to the board, and began to write. The classroom seemed to shrink as Ethan stood in front of the whiteboard, the marker feeling heavier in his hand with each passing second. His eyes darted over the equation Mrs. Bennet had written, a tangled maze of variables, exponents, and fractions. It wasn't the kind of problem most 8th graders would encounter, and it was clear she had chosen it to test him. Behind him, the class whispered and snickered, their hushed voices barely audible but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "No way he's getting that," one boy muttered under his breath. "He doesn't even know where to start," another said, laughing softly. Ethan's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he stared at the board, the problem starting to come into focus. His heart was still pounding, but now, beneath the nerves, there was something else, a spark of determination. He could solve this. He just needed to focus. At her desk, Mrs. Bennet crossed her arms, watching him with a raised eyebrow. To her, this was as much a test of Ethan's focus as it was of his skill. She had always been frustrated by his lack of engagement, especially when it was clear he had potential. Now, she was curious to see what he could do when put on the spot. "Well," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We're waiting." Ethan took a deep breath and lifted the marker. Slowly, deliberately, he began to write. His first strokes were tentative, testing the waters, but as he moved from one step to the next, his hand grew steadier. At first, the class didn't react. Some students had expected him to freeze or give up, and they were surprised when he started to solve the equation. As the numbers and symbols on the board began to connect, murmurs spread through the room. "Wait, is he actually doing it?" a girl in the second row whispered. "Looks like it," her friend replied, leaning forward to see better. Ethan's mind moved quickly, breaking the equation into smaller pieces. He worked methodically, isolating variables, simplifying fractions, and eliminating unnecessary steps. His hand moved faster now, the squeak of the marker against the board filling the silence. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was dismantling it, breaking it down into its core components. The room grew quieter as more students realized what was happening. The whispers stopped, replaced by wide-eyed stares. Even the boy who had laughed earlier was now leaning forward, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Behind Ethan, Mrs. Bennett's expression shifted. She had expected him to struggle, maybe even fail. But as she watched his work unfold, she felt a growing sense of astonishment. His steps were clear, precise, and correct. She stepped closer to the board, her sharp gaze scanning each line of his solution. Ethan paused briefly, double-checking his work before moving to the final steps. He could feel the weight of the class's attention now, but instead of letting it overwhelm him, he used it as fuel. He wrote the last few numbers, circled the answer, and capped the marker with a satisfying click. Stepping back, he turned to face the room. His heart was pounding, but his expression was calm. The whiteboard behind him was filled with neat lines of equations, each step building on the last, leading to the correct answer. For a moment, no one spoke. The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound. Ethan scanned the room, catching glimpses of wide eyes and slack jaws. Even the students who usually ignored him now looked at him with something bordering on awe. Mrs. Bennett stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She studied the board closely, her finger tracing each line of Ethan's solution. Her lips moved silently as she checked his work, her brow furrowing slightly at one point, before smoothing out again. Finally, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable, a mix of surprise and something else. Respect. "This is correct," she said, her voice quieter than usual. A ripple of disbelief spread through the class, followed by a few tentative claps. The applause grew louder, filling the room as more students joined in. Ethan stood there, unsure of how to react. His cheeks burned, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something new, something unfamiliar. Pride. As the clapping subsided, Mrs. Bennett addressed the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said, gesturing to the board. "This is what happens when someone takes the time to understand the material." Ethan didn't just solve this problem, he broke it down, piece by piece, and made it look easy. That's real understanding. Her words hung in the air, and for once, Ethan didn't feel the urge to shrink back into his seat. Instead, he stood a little taller, his hands loosely at his sides. "Ethan," Mrs. Bennett continued, her tone softer now, "why haven't you spoken up before? If you can do this, why do you sit in the back and stay so quiet?" Ethan hesitated, glancing down at his sneakers. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he put into words the fear of standing out, the comfort of staying invisible? After a moment, he shrugged. "I didn't think anyone noticed," he said quietly. Mrs. Bennett's expression softened. "Well," she said, "it's time for that to change." The applause lingered in Ethan's ears as he returned to his seat, the weight of the moment settling over him like a warm blanket. His classmates, still reeling from what they had witnessed, exchanged hushed whispers and occasional glances in his direction. Ethan felt their eyes on him, but this time, they weren't filled with ridicule or indifference. They were wide with curiosity and respect. Mrs. Bennett remained at the front of the room, her hands clasped together as if in deep thought. She wasn't a teacher who was easily impressed, but Ethan had done more than solve a difficult equation. He had upended her assumptions, not just about him, but about how she approached students like him, quiet, reserved, and often overlooked. "Class," she said, raising her voice to silence the murmurs. "What you just saw today is a reminder that everyone in this room has potential. Ethan proved that, and he didn't just solve a problem, he showed us what it looks like to approach something with clarity and focus." Ethan sat at his desk, still holding his notebook in his hands. His heart had finally slowed, but his thoughts raced. He hadn't planned for this. Solving equations in the margins of his notebook had always been a private escape, something he did for himself, not for recognition. Now, for the first time, people were noticing him, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. A girl sitting a row ahead of him turned around, her eyes wide. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I just figured it out," he said, his voice quiet. Another student chimed in. "That was insane? Are you like a genius or something?" Ethan's cheeks burned, and he shook his head quickly. "No, I just like math." As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Mrs. Bennett called out, "Ethan, can you stay for a moment?" The class began to file out, but not before more students stopped to pat Ethan on the back or offer a quick, "That was awesome," as they passed. Ethan nodded awkwardly, clutching his notebook tighter. The attention was new, and while part of him wanted to retreat to his usual quiet corner, another part felt a flicker of pride. Once the room had emptied, Mrs. Bennett leaned against her desk, studying Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Ethan," she began, her tone softer than it had been earlier, "I owe you an apology." Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "An apology?" She nodded. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I like to think I know my students, but with you," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I misjudged you. I thought your quietness meant you weren't interested. I assumed your lack of participation meant you didn't care. Clearly, I was wrong." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "It's okay," he mumbled. "No, it's not," Mrs. Bennett said firmly. "You have a gift, Ethan, and I don't want to see you hide it. Do you realize how rare it is for someone your age to solve a problem like that? To think the way you do?" Ethan looked down at his notebook, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn cover. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I just like doing it. It makes sense to me." Mrs. Bennett's expression softened. "That's exactly what makes it special. You see things differently, and that's something to be proud of. But here's the thing. You can't keep it to yourself. There are programs, competitions, even advanced courses that could help you grow, challenge you. I'd be happy to help you find them if you're interested." Ethan's heart raced. The idea of stepping into a world beyond the quiet comfort of his own learning was both thrilling and terrifying. He thought about the moment at the board, the way the equation had clicked into place, and the way the room had felt different afterward. Could he do more? Could he be more? "I don't know," he admitted. "What if I mess up?" Mrs. Bennett smiled. "Messing up is part of learning. But if you don't try, you'll never know what you're capable of." That night, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table in his family's modest home, his notebook open in front of him. His parents sat nearby, listening intently as he recounted what had happened that day. The equation, the applause, Mrs. Bennett's offer. His mother's eyes glistened with pride as she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Ethan, we've always known you were special. I'm so glad other people are starting to see it too." His father nodded, his deep voice steady. "This is just the beginning, son. Don't be afraid to show the world what you can do." Ethan spent the rest of the evening staring at the blank page of his notebook. For so long, it had been a place for secrets, problems he solved for himself, notes he never shared. But now, it felt like something more, a space for possibilities. He picked up his pencil and began to write, not just equations, but ideas, goals, dreams. For the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid of being seen. He was ready to step forward, to see where his talent could take him. The next day, the atmosphere in room 204 was different. Ethan Brooks, once the quiet kid who blended into the background, now found himself the center of attention. As he walked into the classroom, his classmates greeted him with nods, smiles, and even a few high fives. "Yo, Ethan," a boy called out from the back of the room. "That was crazy yesterday. How'd you even do that?" Ethan hesitated, his usual instinct to shrink from attention battling with a new sense of pride he felt. "I just worked through it," he said modestly, sliding into his usual seat by the window. "That wasn't just working through it," another girl chimed in, leaning across her desk. "You made it look easy. You're like a math wizard or something." Ethan's cheeks flushed, and he shrugged. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice soft but sincere. Even students who hadn't spoken to him before now seemed curious about him. A few asked if he could help them with their homework, and others just wanted to know more about what he was good at. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't invisible. Mrs. Bennet entered the room, her usual brisk energy, accompanied by a glance toward Ethan that carried a trace of a smile. She began the lesson as usual, explaining the day's topic, but her tone was less sharp, her movements less rigid. When she called on Ethan to answer a question during the lesson, her voice was encouraging rather than critical. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then answered confidently, his explanation clear and concise. The class murmured in quiet awe, and Mrs. Bennet nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent," she said, her voice warm. "That's the kind of thinking we need to see more of." After class, Mrs. Bennet asked Ethan to stay behind once more. This time, the conversation wasn't about apologies. It was about opportunities. "Ethan," she began, sitting on the edge of her desk, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday. You have an incredible gift, and I don't want it to go to waste." Ethan looked down at his notebook, unsure of what to say. "I don't really know what to do with it," he admitted. "That's where I can help," Mrs. Bennet said. "There's an advanced math program at the district level, a class for students like you who need more of a challenge. It's after school, twice a week, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Ethan's eyes widened. The idea of joining an advanced class was exciting, but it was also intimidating. "Do you think I'd be good enough for that?" he asked. Mrs. Bennet smiled. "I don't think. You've already proven it. This is a chance for you to explore your potential, to see how far you can go. I've already spoken to the program coordinator, and they're excited to have you." Ethan's mind raced. He thought about the problem on the board, the way the class had looked at him with admiration, and the pride in his parents' eyes when he told them what had happened. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." The following week, Ethan attended his first advanced math class. Walking into the room, he felt the same nervous anticipation that he had felt standing in front of the whiteboard. The other students, some from different schools, were chatting in small groups, their energy vibrant and competitive. As the instructor began the lesson, Ethan quickly realized he was in the right place. The problems were challenging, the pace fast, and the discussions lively. For the first time, he felt surrounded by peers who shared his love for numbers, and it was exhilarating. Back at Willow Creek Middle School, Ethan's reputation as the math kid grew. His classmates began to seek him out for help, not just in math, but as someone they respected. The boy who had once felt invisible was now part of the fabric of the class, his quiet brilliance inspiring others. Mrs. Bennet, too, found herself looking at her students differently. Ethan's transformation had reminded her of the importance of seeing beyond surface behavior, of finding the hidden potential in every student. She made it a point to engage with her quieter students, encouraging them to step forward in their own ways. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table working on a particularly tricky problem for his advanced class, his mother walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she said. "You've always been special, but now the world's starting to see it too." Ethan looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mom," he said, glancing back at his notebook. He paused for a moment, his pencil hovering over the page. For the first time, he wasn't just solving a problem for himself. He was building a future, one equation, one opportunity, one step at a time. As he wrote the next line of his solution, Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle over him. He didn't know exactly where his path would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to follow it. And in that moment, the boy who had once hidden his brilliance knew that he was ready to shine. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.